Hi everybody, this is part 1 of a 2-part video about how to make the paned and puffed sleeves from the Tudor Tailor's fitted English gown. I wanted to make this video because I had a really hard time understanding the directions for how to create these paned and puffed sleeves. This pattern is featured in the Tudor Tailor's book, which I don't own, and there might be a lot more directions about how to make the sleeves in the book along with some pictures. But when you're ordering just the pattern, and I'll link to where you can buy the pattern below, you only get a single page of instructions printed front and back. These instructions have no pictures about how to create the paned and puffed sleeves, so I was having a really hard time understanding just the written directions. It was thanks to a Facebook post on the Facebook group Elizabethan Costuming, where someone else was asking about how to create these sleeves, where I finally understood that some of the steps I had in my mind were really wrong. So I wanted to create this video as a visual aid for other people like me who had a really hard time understanding it at first. Lastly, I want to be clear that I didn't follow directions to a T because I wanted to attach the sleeves to the garment in a way that I've done it on previous costumes I've made. This is not to say that the way that the directions have you attaching the sleeve is wrong. I just personally am really annoyed by bulky underarm seams, and I tend to cut my arm size lower than normal because I hate when they ride up. I was sure to point out where I differed from the pattern directions, and I also tried to make it clear what the pattern directions were telling you to do and how it differed from what I was doing. In part 1, I will be going over preparing your pattern and making the foundation for the sleeve. Okay, so this pattern has 9 pieces for a total of, once you cut out the fabric, 20 pieces just to make a single sleeve, so it's quite complicated. The first piece is the foundation of the sleeve. So this piece has areas for bones in it, and the bones help make the puffed structure of the support of the sleeve. Now, this one is very complicated because you see all these lines in the middle, these dashed lines. Those are for a horizontal support to go around the sleeve. There is no indication of size marking on these. You just kind of have to guess and figure it out. And through the help of some lovely people on the Elizabethan Costume Facebook page, I figured out the boning channels are 2 lines apart. And so if you count up based on what size you have and what the smallest size in the pattern is, you can find your channel. So I cut a size 10, and this pattern starts at a size 8. So the second line up is the bottom line for my boning channel, and then the 4th line is the top line for my boning channel. But overall, that's a very complicated way to do things. Also, when you're reading the instructions, it says to sew tape down for the boning channels, but I don't remember seeing the tape anywhere other in the instructions, so you do need some sort of tape for these. I just wound up making some bias tape that's not really bias tape because it's cut on the grain so that it wouldn't stretch out. The next piece is the puff, which is quite a large piece, and this piece goes over the foundation. It's gathered on both edges, and that makes the puffy part of the sleeve. Then you have these 6 small pieces, and these are the panes of the sleeve. So these are the vertical structure that the puff comes out from. These are so small. I just moved, and it's a miracle I didn't lose any of them. Speaking of small and easy to lose, there's also a bottom band piece, which is just a rectangle, and I did lose that because it's so small and skinny, but I can draft a rectangle no problem, so it's not a huge issue that I lost those. None of these pattern pieces include seam allowance. Most of them I just added on the fabric, especially because I had to transfer so many markings for the foundation. But with these pieces being so small and having to cut out so many of them, I did go ahead and trace them onto another piece of paper so I could add the seam allowance that way. You are supposed to cut out 1 foundation from the lining, 1 puff from a puff fabric, and then 1 each of your facing and your lining fabric on the panes, and 1 each of facing and lining on the band. Here's my lining fabric. The lining fabric for my actual garment is a middleweight linen that has quite a loose weave, so I went ahead and just used muslin because it's stronger to take the stretch of the bones that might impart on it. So there's my foundation. I have a lovely white silk for the puff. Here are all my panes. Of course, there's a lot of them out of my dress fabric, and I simply cut each pane twice in the fabric, so I didn't do a lining fabric. I just lined them with this same fabric. And then here's my band piece. The way they have you construct a band is the historical method, where you have a piece, you fold down all the seam allowances on that piece, then you take the lining fabric, fold down the seam allowances on that, and then hand sew the lining into the piece, which is great. But for a band, I just thought it's so simple just to fold it up and only have to, and then you can machine stitch one side and only have to hand sew the underside and just slip stitch it up to cover the rest of the raw edges. So I just cut the band out of a single piece of fabric. Here is my faux on-grain bias tape. I call it bias tape just because I did use my bias tape maker to fold it, but it is just strips I ripped of muslin on grain. Because you're going to have boning inside of this, it's not always great to do it on bias because that can warp. So if you do it on grain, it's going to have more strength and structure. And you do have to kind of curve it so it makes it a little wonky, but you don't see it in the end. When boning historical things, I usually use reed as a boning because it's lightweight, comfortable, and historically accurate. For these sleeves, I wanted to use something a little stronger because I was afraid that the reed would just break, especially at the curve that it's held at within the sleeve and the beating that the sleeves might take for me moving my arms or leaning back in a chair. So I decided to use plastic instead. I have these plastic zip ties that everyone uses for boning corsets. I do always put a couple of them in my corsets because in high stress areas where I don't want the reed boning to break. These are 18 inches long. They are not long enough for the longest bone that you have to put in. So I had to go out and get these 36-inch ones. I think they do make a 24-inch as well, but I just said to heck with it and went for the longest ones possible. So these are 36 inches long, and they were plenty long to add the long bone in. Okay, so now what needs to happen is sewing the tape for the boning channels onto the foundation. So you can see that I have them all marked out here. There are 3 vertical channels and then 1 horizontal channel. The vertical channels need to be sewn down first, and you are supposed to not sew them past the seam allowance of 1/2 inch. I did go ahead and sew them past the seam allowance for the vertical channels, but on the horizontal ones, I actually sewed well back from that. The horizontal bone is going to be doubled over, so it doesn't actually matter. It's going to support itself. It's going to be taped. I just found it really difficult to get the boning with tape on it through the channels, so I'm going to sew them well back. You can use pins here to hold them down, but I don't find it necessary. Alright, so we've got 1 channel sewn on. I'm going to do the other vertical ones. Okay, so now I have all 3 vertical tapes sewn on, and it's time to sew the horizontal one. As I mentioned before, it gets a little tricky because the tape that we're using is not cut on the bias, so it doesn't want to curve nicely. It is a subtle curve, so it doesn't wind up too bad in the end. It'll be a little wrinkly, but no one's going to see it. When you get to the point where the horizontal tape is going to cross the vertical tapes, you have to jump the vertical tape. You don't want to sew through it, or else your bone won't be able to go up through it. So I'm just going to back stitch right here, then lift my presser foot and move the fabric to the next point so that I won't be sewing through the vertical bar. Now it's time to go back, and you can see the tape standing up a little bit, and that's a result of the curve, so just try to push it down as much as you can. It's going to maybe have a few wrinkles and pin tucks in it. If you're not super confident at sewing, you should probably definitely be using pins. It'll make it a lot easier for you. Now that that's all sewn down, on the top of all of the vertical bars, you can sew a 1/2 inch down and sew back and forth across it a couple times to create the stopper for the boning. At this point, you are supposed to run some gathering stitches along the top, and just do that within your seam allowance. I just did one, and then you are going to sew the ends together. And I actually sewed the ends together so that the seam allowance is on the same side as the boning channels. That is just to hide the seam allowance within the sleeve once I'm done. You'll notice that on this pattern, one end is actually longer by almost a centimeter than the other. That kind of bothers me, but also if you look at the pattern, that longer end is the front, and it did help me orient it throughout the process. So kind of useful, but also kind of annoying. Now I'm just going to give it a good press and also probably try to remove some of the blue marks that I had left with my water-soluble pen. Okay, so now I have all of the boning channels sewn on, and I have the back part sewn up. And so according to the directions, the next step is to insert the bones into the channels. And I have all my bones right here that I've sized and cut, and I just rounded the edges a little bit and melted them a tad to make them not sharp. But I find if you put the bones in right now, it makes it really, really difficult to do all of the other sewing. So I recommend leaving the bones in till one of the later parts. My horizontal bone, I made it so that it overlaps quite a few inches just to help it get the best shape. And then I have my 3 vertical bones, but I'm not going to put them in right now because I think that it makes everything a lot more difficult. We can gather down the gathering stitches that we put on the top of the foundation piece so that it matches the armhole of the jacket. Now here's where my construction is going to differ significantly from the Tudor Tailor instructions. The Tudor Tailor has you sewing the sleeve into the jacket and then binding the raw edges of your seam with some bias tape at the end. I didn't want to do this because there's a lot of fabric going into this sleeve. There's a lot of fabric in my jacket because I did an interlining on it to make it a lot stiffer. So I didn't want to do that. So instead, you can see I clean finished the edge of my jacket with some bias tape. And I'm going to clean finish the edge of the sleeve as well. And then I'm going to sew them together, but it's going to give me a really, really nice flat seam that is not going to be bulky, and it's going to be clean finish on both sides. And if in the future I wanted to change the sleeves at all, it'd be really easy to remove the sleeves and not damage the jacket because the jacket is already finished. So in order to gather it down, I'm just going to start pulling stitches and then match it up kind of around the edge and see when it fits, and when it fits I'm going to stop it and tie the knots. Alright, so I have the foundation gathered down to match the armhole size of my jacket. I hope that if you decide to follow this pattern, you find this video helpful. And if you don't decide to follow this pattern, you find it at least informative or entertaining. That's it for part 1. Make sure to subscribe so you can stay tuned for part 2 on how to create the panes, the puff, and finish the sleeve.